Just like Lucifer, who's counting down the minutes for his chance to get revenge for his humiliation. The bully from Lee's school, who had just regained consciousness, was eager to see Lee dead. Still lying in his hospital bed, he grabbed his phone and decided to call someone tougher to teach Lee a lesson. Fueled by burning anger, he scrolled through his contacts until he found the person he was looking for. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, someone was hard at work on a punching bag. That someone was Kong Cheol, the youth division middleweight boxing champion. His intense training session was suddenly interrupted by an obnoxiously loud ringtone. Annoyed, Kong stopped mid-punch, sweat dripping down his body, and turned to see whose phone was making the ridiculous noise. That's when a blonde guy walked in and casually mentioned it was his phone. He strolled over, picked it up, and answered, sounding irritated. The caller was none other than the beaten bully, desperation evident in his voice. Without any introduction, he told Kong that he would buy him a new phone if he could do one small favor first. Initially surprised by the request, Kong thought it sounded like an easy and good deal, so he agreed and asked what he needed to do in return. The next day, during class, everything seemed normal again as the bully walked in as if nothing had happened the day before. As he made his way to his seat, the entire classroom suddenly fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. Soon, murmurs and whispers filled the room as students talked about how someone who used to bully others had ended up in such a pathetic state. At first, he tried to ignore it, but when the whispers turned into jokes about him being neutered, he couldn't take it anymore. To show he wasn't someone to mess with, he slammed his backpack on the floor and yelled that he could still take them all down, even after being neutered. He challenged anyone who doubted his strength to fight him. At that moment, the class president, a girl with glasses, stood up and shouted back, telling him to either shut up or leave the classroom. Seeing her dare to talk to him like that only made him angrier. Frustrated that even the class president had the audacity to stand up to him, he completely lost it. In a fit of rage, he grabbed a random chair and attempted to throw it at her, trying to remind everyone they should fear him like they used to. Before he could do anything, the door suddenly swung open, and a massive, hulking teacher walked into the classroom, demanding to know what all the fuss was about. To everyone's surprise, the bully instantly dropped into his seat, acting as if nothing had happened. The teacher looked around and noticed the class president standing there, clearly angry. He asked her what was going on and why she was out of her seat. However, the girl didn't spill the truth. Instead, she quickly returned to her seat and assured him it wasn't anything worth mentioning. The teacher didn't press further, but for some reason, he told the girl to meet him after class, which piqued her curiosity. When the school day ended, she met him as instructed. It turned out he wanted a favor. Since she was the class president and someone he could trust, he asked her to check on Lee Ho, who had been absent that day and wasn't answering his phone. In exchange, the teacher promised to write her a recommendation letter for her senior year. Framed as a request, the girl knew she couldn't exactly say no, so she reluctantly agreed. Before long, she found herself standing in front of Lee's house, looking completely uninterested in whatever situation he might be in. Wanting to get this over with as quickly as possible, she didn't waste any time. She walked up to the door and knocked, calling out to see if anyone was home. When no one responded, she hesitated for a moment before deciding to check if the door was locked. Turning the doorknob, she realized it wasn't. To her surprise, the door swung open, so she slowly stepped inside. The moment she walked in, she froze in shock. Right in front of her was Lee's lifeless body, surrounded by a filthy room where bugs seemed to be playing hide and seek. Lee's appearance was horrifying. His eyes had rolled back completely white, and his mouth was wide open. The sight made the girl scream in terror, thinking Lee was dead. Without wasting another second, she grabbed her phone and called for an ambulance. The paramedics arrived quickly and rushed Lee to the nearest hospital. It didn't take long for the doctors to determine what had happened. Lee had likely fainted from pure starvation, abandoned by God Mu, who had left his body earlier. He was hospitalized and hooked up to a nutrient for to stabilize him. Just then, something strange occurred. As Lee's body lay still, it suddenly twitched. In an instant, Mu returned to Lee's body. The moment Mu opened his eyes, he felt completely disoriented. The place didn't look familiar at all. Confused, he tried to figure out where he was and how he had ended up there. Before he could make sense of anything, he felt something odd. Looking down, he realized something was attached to his hand. It was the for delivering the nutrient serum. As a god who had lived solely for battle and fighting, Mu had no knowledge of human tools or technology in this era, and this strange serum was no exception. He stared at it with a mix of curiosity and unease, trying to process what was happening. Even though he didn't understand what the serum was, Mu quickly figured out that it was sending something into his body. Thanks to his godly knowledge, he realized it was nutrients, and he could sense his body absorbing them rapidly, speeding up his recovery. To Mu, it felt like some kind of healing magic, though he knew very well it wasn't magic. As Lee started to move his head around and regain consciousness, the girl sitting nearby finally noticed he was awake. However, the creepy smile on his face made her think he looked a little crazy. Still, she asked if Lee knew what had caused him to faint. Not waiting for an answer, she grabbed her bag, stood up, and announced she was heading back to school to report everything to the teacher, as he had asked her to. Mu quickly sat up and tried to stop her. He didn't know who this girl was exactly, but he assumed she was the one who had helped him recover so quickly. However, even after realizing that, he didn't thank her. Instead, in typical Mu fashion, he asked for something else entirely. The girl was in a hurry to leave, but Mu was eager to gather more information about Earth and how people lived there. Pulling the 4 out of his hand, he gave his usual creepy smile and asked if she knew a place where he could train to get stronger. The girl turned her head slightly and gave him a side glance. Honestly, he looked anything but athletic to her. Coupled with the poor, dirty condition of his house, it didn't seem like he truly cared about sports. Still, after a moment of thought, she suggested a specific place for him, an outdoor gym at a nearby park with some simple workout equipment. Not wasting any time, Mu made his way to the park and began his training. He quickly started doing pull-ups on the bars, pushing his body as hard as he could. When he finally grew tired, he dropped to the ground to take a break. Sweat dripped off his body as he looked around, and Mu couldn't help but feel impressed. To him, these simple pieces of exercise equipment looked like professional training tools. It had been almost 4,000 years since he last set foot on Earth, and after that, he hadn't bothered to check on human progress. As the Earth god, even these basic workout machines left him in awe. Back in his time, humans trained using entirely different, more primitive methods that were far harder and less efficient. This modern equipment, though simple by human standards, was revolutionary in Mu's eyes. He started randomly testing each piece of equipment, even though he had no idea how any of it worked. Suddenly, in the middle of his training, something small, like a pebble, hit him on the back and fell to the ground. To his surprise, it was the beaten bully from earlier, and this time he had brought someone along, a boxer named Hyung. Even with the boxer beside him, the bully acted like a barking dog, yelling insults at Lee from a safe distance but not daring to step closer. Mu couldn't care less about the barking. He calmly sat down, picked up the rock, and asked who had thrown it. Feeling a little braver now that Hyung was there to back him up, the beaten-up guy shouted that he was the one who did it. He began ranting about how Lee would pay for hurting him, bragging about how Hyung, his cousin and a professional boxer, was going to beat Mu to death. But before he could finish, Mu seized an opening and caught him off guard with a sudden punch. The guy hit the ground, screaming in pain as his already broken nose got smashed again. This was the result of starting a fight with God Mu by throwing a stone, and Mu couldn't have been happier about it. While this was happening on Earth, things were a bit more complicated in the realm of the gods. The time for the usual meeting of the gods had arrived, but Mu was nowhere to be seen. His only assistant, the dragonling, had to attend the meeting in his place. With his lord absent, the nervous little dragon stuttered as he awkwardly began to deliver Mu's message. Before the dragonling could even get through the first few words of the letter, Lucifer suddenly interrupted, glaring at the dragon. He demanded to know why a mere assistant dared to step into a meeting meant for gods, let alone speak first. Lucifer's intimidating demeanor scared the poor dragonling out of his wits. Panicking, the dragon quickly clarified that he was only there to deliver a message from God Mu and had no intention of disrespecting or offending anyone with his presence. Determined to fulfill his duty and get out of there before things escalated, the dragonling began to read the letter with a trembling voice. But the message turned out to be nothing out of the ordinary. As usual, Mu was simply asking the gods to let him know if they came across any worthy opponents for him to fight. That was it. Lucifer couldn't hold back his anger after hearing that and slammed the table with a resounding bang. As the second most powerful god in the divine realm, he couldn't stand how Mu not only did whatever he pleased but also ignored the meeting and the gods entirely. Lucifer wasn't wrong, and most of the gods silently agreed with him. However, even in Mu's absence, none of them dared to openly criticize him. Lucifer pressed on, declaring that the gods' meeting was meant to ensure the stability and safety of their worlds. As the third strongest god, and of course as someone already on Mu's list of playthings, the archer god finally spoke up. He argued that if any abnormalities occurred, even on Earth, they were the ones who should always take care of them instead of Mu, and that was the most unacceptable thing for the strongest god among them. Seizing the moment, Lucifer slammed the table again, his voice booming with frustration. He shouted that Mu's habit of treating everything like a game was pushing all the worlds to the brink of collapse. In his opinion, the few times Mu actually decided to resolve something usually ended up making things worse. To make his argument more convincing, Lucifer turned to the god of Cyclops, the ninth-ranked deity in the divine realm, and asked if he remembered what Mu had done 1,000 years ago when the Cyclops planet was on the verge of destruction. Back then, a massive, ugly creature as large as the Cyclops planet itself had attacked a rare being known as a void creature, capable of devouring an entire planet in seconds. Just as the void creature began tearing the Cyclops planet apart, something suddenly shot straight through its center, splitting it into two unequal pieces. That something, of course, was God Mu. With his usual cheerful and flushed face, delighted at the chance for a fight, Mu had effortlessly killed the enormous creature in an instant. Lucifer used this event to drive his point home, trying to make everyone, especially the Cyclops god, see that Mu was to blame for the aftermath of the destruction. He explained that if Mu had cooperated with the other gods instead of acting alone, there wouldn't have been any casualties. Having made his case and likely swaying the other gods to his side, Lucifer declared that they could no longer stand by and let someone unfit to be a god continue risking the safety of their worlds. On the other side, the dragonling was left speechless. He couldn't do or say anything to defend his lord. The only thing he could do was silently pray and beg Mu to return before things spiraled even further out of control. The scene shifted back to Earth, where the beaten bully started making noise again. He barked at Mu, warning him once more that his boxer cousin was going to make him pay for what he had done. Hyung, the so-called boxer cousin, was intrigued. He couldn't help but be a little impressed by how fast Mu had moved and punched earlier. Curiously, he asked if Mu practiced any sports, like martial arts. Mu casually replied that he didn't play any sports because all he wanted was to fight, not play. Mu's response, however, made Hyung think of him as nothing more than an overconfident, dumb middle schooler. Spitting out his chewing gum with a smirk, Hyung took a fighting stance and declared he was ready to fight, just as Mu had apparently wanted. Deciding to start first, Hyung moved quickly to test whether Mu was all talk or actually had some skill. His opening strike was fast and sharp, landing hard on Mu's face before Mu could dodge or block. Despite the satisfaction of landing the first blow, something about Mu stunned Hyung. There was something strange, something downright unusual, about this opponent that sent a chill running up his spine. As an experienced boxer who carefully observed his opponent's movements, Hyung found it odd that Mu didn't move an inch, even though he had clearly been watching the punch come from the start. Like the beaten bully who had hired him, Hyung had no idea that his opponent wasn't human but a god, and not just any god, but one absolutely obsessed with fighting. What Hyung also didn't know was that Mu never dodged a preemptive strike. For him, taking the first hit was like a signal confirming that the battle had officially begun. With his usual unsettling, overly excited grin, Mu suddenly shouted, "Is hand-to-hand combat your favorite thing?" His creepy smile and strange behavior made Hyung wonder if this guy was just some crazy teenager. Then, out of nowhere, Mu mimicked Hyung's fighting stance and launched himself forward. Hyung didn't take it seriously at all, thinking it was just a silly copycat move. When Mu threw a punch, Hyung effortlessly blocked it, or so he thought. The force behind Mu's punch sent Hyung sliding backward, completely surprising him. His hand throbbed in pain from underestimating the strength of this seemingly weak and scrawny guy. Meanwhile, Mu looked even more thrilled. His face lit up with excitement as he realized his attack had worked perfectly just by copying what Hyung had done earlier. However, there was one thing Mu had to keep in mind: his current body wasn't something he could fully rely on just yet. When he tensed his muscles as hard as he could at the moment of impact, the strain left his arms screaming in pain, as if they wanted to quit and take a break. Of course, Mu didn't care about the state of his muscles or how much they were suffering. In fact, the more pain he endured, the more he enjoyed the fight. For him, it only made the battle more satisfying. The thrill of this fight couldn't even compare to the feeling of battling creatures in his godly form. It was raw and exhilarating in a completely different way. Suddenly, to Hyung's surprise, Mu pulled off his belt and wrapped it around his fist. The fact that his current fragile body could cause trouble, especially since recovery and healing would take significantly longer, pushed him to come up with this idea. The beaten bully, still watching from the sidelines, thought using a belt made the fight unfair, but neither Mu nor Hyung cared about his opinion. Hyung rushed forward again, this time fully aware that he couldn't afford to underestimate Mu. He started throwing punches left and right, one after another, trying to overwhelm him with speed and power. Mu managed to block most of the incoming strikes, but even so, he found himself in a rough situation. His movements were limited by the pain in his body, and Hyung's attacks were relentless. In the middle of defending himself, Mu began analyzing his opponent's movements and quickly realized they were fast and precise, but far too predictable. Just by observing Hyung's fighting style, Mu quickly began to anticipate his every move. At first, it was hard to figure out, but less than a minute into the fight, Mu was already dodging Hyung's attacks with ease. If that wasn't enough, when Hyung tried to catch him off guard with a different move, Mu not only blocked the attack but also turned the tables by punching his arm mid-swing. It only took seconds for Hyung to process what had just happened and how his arm ended up broken. He began screaming as the shock wore off and the pain set in. Mu watched him silently, almost amused by his reaction. The screaming made Mu wonder if Hyung and that guy from Lee's class were really cousins, as they seemed to share the same overly dramatic tendencies. Mu didn't waste much time, though. He sealed his victory with another sudden punch to the distracted Hyung, knocking him out cold for a while. The sight left his friend, or cousin, or whoever he was, completely stunned. Things went from bad to worse for him as Mu's face shifted into a frighteningly excited expression, practically radiating his eagerness to fight. He declared it was time to pay for all the trouble caused, especially since this wasn't the first time they had messed with him. The once bully, who had been so arrogant earlier, realized in that moment that with Hyung out of the picture, there was no one left to save him. He had no doubt that a painful fate awaited him now, and there was no escaping it. Mu slowly walked toward Lee's classmate to settle things for the day. As he got closer, Mu noticed that the guy had no intention or will to fight back, and there was no joy or honor in beating up someone who looked so scared. For a moment, the beaten bully sensed Mu's hesitation and thought that if he kept acting this way and simply admitted he didn't want to fight anymore, everything might end peacefully. But it was too late to play the victim now. Before he even had the chance to say anything, Mu punched him in the face in one swift move. After all, this was the same guy who had started today's fight by throwing that small stone and bringing a boxer to take Mu down. He couldn't back out now, and even if he wanted to, Mu had more than enough reason to beat him again. As expected, Mu didn't show any mercy and kept hitting the guy however he wanted, testing out his newly copied fighting techniques on his opponent's body one after another. Even as the guy's face and body became covered in bruises and blood, Mu wasn't satisfied. He finished it off with one final brutal knee strike straight to the guy's already battered face. After putting all his strength into making this an unforgettable day for the bully, Mu finally felt satisfied. He wondered, with a mocking tone in his mind, why the guy wouldn't just admit defeat, but deep down, Mu knew he hadn't given the poor guy even the slightest chance to do so. After finishing with both of them, Mu walked away, knowing he had other things to take care of. Like all his previous opponents, he left his mark on that boxer and added him to his growing list of playthings. The beaten bully, after learning his painful lesson, muttered Lee's name under his breath, calling him a crazy bastard. It wasn't long before Mu returned to Lee's house. Sitting on his bed, he felt great knowing everything was going exactly as he wanted and that he could enjoy fighting almost every day. However, just like before, his weak muscles and fragile bones, which often gave him trouble, were annoying and somewhat concerning. Still, to hold on to this feeling, a mix of fighting opponents stronger than him and experiencing the pain and recovery throughout his body, Mu decided he would do whatever it took. He resolved to return to the God realm first to see what was going on there and to retrieve what he had asked the Dragonling to prepare for him. As always, he focused and tried to leave Lee's body and return to his original form. But this time, unlike before when his soul would transfer instantly, several seconds passed and nothing happened. Mu slowly opened his eyes and squinted, glancing around, only to realize he was still in Lee's house. He couldn't help but wonder why he couldn't return to his body in the God realm. The reason for this incident traced back to a few days ago in Lucifer's domain, when he had forcefully thrown Lee onto Elmer's planet without Lucifer's permission. As we already know, that day, Mu had completely ignored Lucifer and had come and gone as he pleased, unaware that his actions were pushing Lucifer to his limits. On his way back to his domain that day, the Dragonling had asked Mu about his journey to Earth. Mu explained how much he enjoyed it but also mentioned the weakness of his new body. During that conversation, Mu had ordered his assistant to find a recovery magic orb for him while he was gone, hoping it would help his weak body recover faster on Earth. There was just one small problem: magical items were common on Elmer and a few other planets under Lucifer's control, where they were abundant due to the plentiful mana. In contrast, on Earth, magical items could only be obtained through divine blessings or whims, making them incredibly rare. Because of this, only a handful of people throughout human history had been able to use them, and those who could were often regarded as godlike beings by humans. Not long after Mu arrived at his domain, the Dragonling promised to find a recovery magic orb for him the next time he returned to the God realm. When Mu got off the dragon, his assistant reminded him once again about the upcoming God's meeting. That's when Mu casually searched his pants, saying he had prepared something for him due to all the complaints. To the assistant's disbelief, it wasn't anything grand, just a small letter. After delivering his message and fulfilling what he considered his responsibility, Mu approached the miniature Earth model and placed his hand on its surface to return to Lee's body. The Dragonling, clearly annoyed, angrily tried to convince him to at least wait and attend the meeting before leaving, but all the complaints fell on deaf ears as Mu completely ignored him, just as before, and transferred his soul back to Earth. Unbeknownst to both of them, a small demon hovered in the sky, silently observing and reporting every move to Mu's greatest enemy. The scene shifted back to the present, where Lucifer was analyzing the situation. He had no idea what Mu was up to, but he was certain his body was now empty of a soul. The fact that Mu hadn't shown up for the meeting made Lucifer realize he wouldn't be in the god realm for a while. That's when it hit him, the time had come to act. This was his once-in-a-thousand-years opportunity to finally get his revenge, and there was no way he was going to miss it. Without any warning, determined to eliminate the one obstacle standing between him and Mu, Lucifer suddenly activated his life taxidermy spell. As the spell took effect, sharp purple lightning bolts shaped like spears appeared above the Dragonling. But the Dragonling's sharp senses didn't fail him, not one to be caught off guard. He leaped back just in time, dodging every single spear-like attack in less than the blink of an eye. His previously awkward and ashamed expression quickly shifted to one of seriousness and readiness for battle. With a firm voice, he demanded an explanation. "What's the meaning of this?" he asked sharply, his eyes glowing with intensity as he pressed further for confirmation. "Lucifer, are you seriously declaring war against Mu, the god of Earth?" Now filled with confidence, knowing Mu wasn't around to interfere, Lucifer floated slowly in midair. With a booming voice, he declared that he would personally expel Mu from the seat of divinity. He knew exactly what those words meant and didn't hesitate to confirm it. It was an official declaration of war. The Dragonling didn't waste any time. Without hesitation, he compressed his fiery breath and unleashed a deadly blast of flames that resembled a laser shooting straight toward Lucifer. At first, it seemed like Lucifer was caught off guard by the sudden attack, but even without expecting it, he effortlessly dodged it with ease. Strangely, instead of dissipating, the dragon's attack spun around the god's planet-like realm and exploded violently on the far side. The explosion was massive and so intense that the archer god had to quickly conjure a magical shield. He first used it to protect himself and then extended it to shield the other gods attending the meeting. Unlike the others, Lucifer didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle, not to run, not to shield himself, nothing. The waves and flames from the explosion, reminiscent of a nuclear blast, soon reached the meeting, roaring toward them with unstoppable force. As expected from the gods, neither Lucifer, the Dragonling, nor anyone else took any damage. Realizing his first deadly attack had been completely ineffective against Lucifer, the Dragonling decided to use his ultimate move, Polymorph Release. The moment he activated it, his entire body began to transform, not just his arms and legs, but every part of him started expanding. Wild red lightning crackled around him, and a fierce aura surrounded the dragon, making it clear just how serious he was about protecting his master. But even after such a legendary transformation, Lucifer was not the least bit impressed. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The demon god smirked and confidently declared, "I'll deal with you, Mu's little servant, easily. Then it'll be Mu's turn to pay for what he did to me." The dragon, however, had no intention of letting that happen. He was fully committed to defending his master, no matter the cost. But things didn't go as the dragon had planned. Mu's royal assistant was easily defeated by Lucifer, unable to leave even a scratch on him. His entire body was trapped in Lucifer's life taxidermy spell, leaving him immobile and badly injured. The archer god let out a sigh and decided to leave, casually stating that the atmosphere wasn't suitable anymore for a proper godly meeting. Everyone else was left frozen in shock, stunned by the aftermath of the battle between Lucifer and the Dragonling. They were too scared to make a move, let alone help either side. The archer god's departure didn't escape Lucifer's notice. Suddenly, Lucifer called out to him and, with a piercing glance, demanded to know whose side he was on, whether he supported the expulsion or opposed it. The archer god, however, just kept floating away casually, responding that he was neutral, neither supporting nor opposing. Lucifer didn't like the answer but made it clear he was fine with it as long as the archer god didn't interfere. Turning to the rest of the gods, Lucifer coldly asked if anyone objected to Mu's expulsion. After witnessing the Dragonling's state, someone as powerful as a god utterly defeated, none of them dared to speak up. Meanwhile, the Dragonling was still alive and tried to warn Lucifer, reminding him that he was no match for God Mu. But Lucifer just smirked and responded with a chilling revelation. He knew that Mu wasn't here and was instead living in a weak, pathetic human body on Earth. The Dragonling was stunned. He hadn't expected Lucifer to know this secret, especially since he thought he was the only one aware of it. In that moment, everything started to click. It all made sense now why Lucifer had suddenly decided to rebel against Mu. However, Lucifer didn't admit that he had learned the secret by spying on God Mu. Instead, he shifted the blame onto the dragon, claiming that his overconfidence in his strength and lack of vigilance had given Lucifer the opportunity to figure it out. The dragonling couldn't stand to hear such disrespectful words. With no other options left, he decided to make one last desperate attempt to stop Lucifer. Using his massive tail, he launched a surprise attack, hoping to catch Lucifer off guard. But once again, things didn't go as planned. Lucifer remained perfectly still, pretending not to notice until the very last second. Then, with precision and ease, he dodged the attack and slashed through the dragon's tail with a magical weapon. Whether it was a spear or a sword didn't matter, Lucifer's power was undeniable. The poor dragon's tail was cut into several pieces. There was a reason Lucifer didn't just finish him off. He knew that as long as Mu's assistant was alive, he could use him to locate Mu on Earth. The thought of confronting Mu in that weak human body and making him suffer for all the humiliations he had endured filled Lucifer with satisfaction. His devilish laughter echoed in the air while the dragonling coughed up blood repeatedly, his body trembling and powerless to stop Lucifer. Later that day on Earth, things weren't looking much better for Hyung. Covered in wounds, he was being harshly scolded by his coach for getting into a street fight. To make matters worse, he was being forced to take a long recovery break right before his important matches. After the lecture, his coach finally dismissed him. As Hyung made his way out of the gym, he couldn't help but mentally blame Lee for the mess he was in. Just as he reached the exit, Kong walked into the gym, leaving the two of them awkwardly face to face. Kong immediately noticed Hyung's beaten appearance and sour mood. Without hesitation, he asked what had happened to him. Feeling embarrassed, Hyung couldn't bring himself to admit that he had been beaten by some random weak-looking guy. Knowing that Kong was one of the best boxers in the country, a sneaky idea popped into his head. He lowered his bruised face, putting on a shameful and sad expression, and started to lie about what had happened. To make it more convincing, he even forced himself to cry, letting tears fall onto the floor as he explained how he had stepped in to help his brother who was being bullied, only to have the bullies gang up on him and beat him mercilessly. He really went all out, crying like a little kid and covering his face to look like an innocent victim just trying to do the right thing. To Hyung's surprise, Kong didn't seem moved at all. He simply ignored the tears and walked past him casually, reminding Hyung that he had no one to blame but himself. Kong told him he needed to be more careful, especially before his competitions, and walked away without another word. Seeing his plan fail and Kong now out of sight, Hyung immediately stopped crying, his face shifting to one of disappointment. But just as he turned to leave, he froze when Kong suddenly called out, "By the way." For a moment, Hyung panicked, thinking Kong had seen right through him and realized the whole thing was a fake act. But to his surprise, it was the complete opposite. Kong actually believed him and was now asking for the name of the person who had done this to him. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Mu was still sitting on Lee's dirty bed, unable to stop thinking about why he couldn't return to his original body. His frustration and confusion grew by the second. Based on his divine knowledge and experience, he concluded that there could only be one reason for his inability to return: his body had to be seriously damaged. Even this explanation didn't sit well with Mu. He was convinced that not only was the dragonling, a being as strong as a god, protecting him, but his godly body wasn't something that could be easily harmed. Shocked, Mu's eyes widened as the realization hit him. He pieced the whole incident together and thought, what if all the gods joined forces to attack me? That seemed to make the most sense. Panicking, he suddenly jumped out of bed. If his theory was correct, he didn't have time to waste, he needed to act fast. But try as he might, he couldn't think of anything to do, which only fueled his anger. Frustrated, he punched Lee's pillow to release some of his built-up rage. The thought that things could spiral out of control if he didn't return to his body made him feel even worse. The idea that those gods, who wouldn't dare face him one-on-one, were now cowardly taking advantage of his situation was unbearable. Unable to contain his fury, Mu started punching the bed and the pillow repeatedly. In his mind, he wished for just one chance to turn the tables and teach all those cowardly gods a lesson. If he got that opportunity, he vowed to make stew out of the lot of them. After a few minutes of venting his frustration, he grew tired and stopped punching. Realizing it was better to calm down and think things through, he reminded himself that the dragonling, his protector, wasn't someone who would go down easily, even if all the gods teamed up against him. That thought helped him relax a little. He began to consider that if he couldn't do anything about his original body right now, he might as well focus on this one. At least it would give him a better chance of staying alive. With that in mind, he headed back to the training area, this time putting his full effort into strengthening the rest of his body, momentarily ignoring his arm muscles. Training his abdominal muscles for the first time made Mu feel like they were screaming in pain, but oddly enough, that pain made the training more enjoyable for him. As he hung and pulled himself up, the more pain he felt, the louder he laughed. His laughter echoed around the place, and of course, his obnoxious antics annoyed everyone nearby, making them think he was just a crazy, creepy kid. In the midst of his intense training, someone suddenly called his name, startling Mu and causing him to lose focus and fall straight to the ground with a loud thud. The person who had called him was none other than Lee's class president. She looked clearly annoyed, but not because of Mu's loud noises. No, she was upset because Lee hadn't shown up to school for several days. To avoid creating a scene, they decided to have their conversation somewhere calmer. They found a bench in a quiet corner and sat down. Mu casually started the conversation by saying, "Why would I need to go to school? It's not exactly a place where I can train my body." Hearing this, the girl frowned and asked, "Why do you want to train all the time?" Mu shrugged and replied simply, "I train to get stronger, that's it." The class president tilted her head and asked, "And why do you want to get stronger?" Mu grinned and said, "To fight better and take on bigger opponents, of course. My body's too weak right now, and that makes everything harder." From there, Mu launched into an excited rant, rambling on about his reasons for fighting and training. He talked for hours, barely stopping to breathe, leaving the girl with no choice but to sit there and listen to his endless chatter. By the time the sun started to set, she still hadn't managed to convince Mu to come back to school and was running out of ideas. Then suddenly, an idea clicked in her mind. Casually, as if it were no big deal, she said, "What's the point of training so hard if there's no one to fight?" Her words hung in the air, catching Mu completely off guard. To make his point clear, he asked her to look around, pointing out that there was no one there who could challenge him, no matter how strong he got. The girl stood up, preparing to leave, and said, "All you have to do is come to school, meet some people, and start some conflict. Then you'll have plenty of people to fight." With that, she walked off, leaving Mu to think it over. As she left, he couldn't help but feel a little impressed by her reasoning. She had a point. After what he did to those poor bullies, they wouldn't dare come near him again. Without them, he needed to find someone stronger to fight if he wanted to improve and make this body stronger. For the first time, he actually considered going to school. Just as he was mulling it over, a shadowy figure appeared behind him and called out, asking if he was Lee. The figure was wearing a mask to conceal his identity and carrying a weapon. Mu, on the other hand, didn't bother answering the question. He already knew what this was about. His shocked expression shifted to one of relief. Things were going much more smoothly than he had expected. Now he didn't even need to search for his next opponent, as his opponent had come straight to him. With a small smirk, Mu calmly turned his head, preparing himself for the inevitable first strike and the confirmation of battle.